Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Thursday the 17th of March. My name's Maggie Lennon and I'd like to apologise for the slightly late start in the show. We had a last minute technical glitch. We were blaming it on St Patrick Day leprechauns getting into the studio. We'll start the show with an update of what's been happening in the last 24 hours in Ukraine. Losses were increasing in the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv, with 53 people killed by Russian forces on Wednesday. We're suffering heavy losses. 53 citizens were killed yesterday, the regional governor reported. One person was killed by a Russian missile attack in Kyiv this morning, according to reports by Ukraine's emergency services. The rescue team said they'd received a report of the residential building on fire in the Darnsky district at 5 a.m. this morning. Ukrainian authorities were struggling to determine the fate of hundreds of civilians who had been sheltering in a theatre smashed by a Russian airstrike in the besieged city of Mariupol, the Associated Press reported. An educational institute in Mariupol, a city in the Kharkiv region, was also reportedly struck by Russian missiles overnight, Ukraine's state emergency services have said. The Kremlin claimed it was putting colossal energy into talks on a possible peace deal with its Ukrainian counterparts. Our delegation is putting in colossal effort and demonstrates more readiness towards them than the other side, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said. The UK Defence Ministry released an intelligence report stating that the Russian invasion of Ukraine had largely stalled on all fronts. The Ukrainian military also released its morning operational report. It said Russia had been unsuccessful in carrying out its ground operation and continued to launch rocket strikes on Ukrainian cities. Officials said Russian troops were waging cyber attacks and destroying TV and radio signals to discredit Ukraine's leadership. Ukraine has asked Japan for high-quality satellite images to help it fend off Russian troops, the Nikkei newspaper reported this morning. The Ukraine refugee exodus was continuing, with a majority of people seeking refuge in neighbouring Poland. According to the United Nations, estimates of more than 3 million people have fled Ukraine since Russia invaded on the 24th of February. And 30 minutes ago, we got an update on the story about the 48 orphans who have been trying to get to Scotland. And it's just been announced that they will in fact arrive later this week, that finally the Home Office has managed to sort out the paperwork. And it's not quite sure where they're going, but I believe that they may be being sent to Edinburgh. I'm joined in the studio tonight. What a delight to have someone actually in the studio with me by Broadcasting Scotland regular Brian Liddy. Good evening, Brian. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you, Maggie.
That's good. We'll stick then with the first story with the Ukraine. More than 20 people were killed and 25 injured when a Russian airstrike destroyed a school and a community centre in Mariupol, close to the northeast Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, local officials said. The attack took place at 3:30 a.m. local time, that's 1:30 UK time, this morning, the Kharkiv prosecutor's office said on Telegram. It said 21 people were killed and 10 were in a critical condition. Local authorities said the city of Mariupol, home to 21,500 residents, came under fire overnight as missiles struck a school, a community centre and a scientific institution. The region has seen heavy fighting and a heavy bombardment in a bid by stalled Russian forces to advance. Around 30,000 civilians have fled the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol, local authorities said. Mariupol's City Hall said on Telegram that around 30,000 people have left on their transport, adding that 80% of residential housing in the city had been destroyed. Brian, it's obvious that the ground offensive has stalled. It's not entirely sure why that is, but it has stalled, and therefore there's nothing really left to the Russians to do except to utilise the fact that they've got superior air power. The Russians have also been saying, quite unbelievably, that they don't bomb cities and towns. So do you think they're trying to persuade us that actually the Ukrainians are doing this to themselves?
That's the only explanation that you can imagine in this situation. All I can think is that Russia and Putin and the Russian army are. I mean, not only are they trying to accept us, to get us to accept those lies, but they're also trying to get the people back home to accept the same lies. I just wonder if maybe one of the things I wonder if things are going to change back in Russia when mothers and fathers begin to have their sons brought back to Russia in metal casks or
Well,
whatever.
that's a really interesting point, because that's exactly what began to turn the tide of America against the war in Vietnam. And it took more than 24 days or 3 weeks to do that. It took several years. But I think that is true. I think as people begin to see people coming home, there's been a slightly unpleasant air as well, I think, to some Western reporting that somehow we should be celebrating when the supposed casualties of the Russians are being announced as going up. And most of the casualties that the Ukrainians have announced for the Russian army have not been verified by anyone, so we don't know how true it is. But we mustn't forget, these are young men, some of them, 18-year-olds, many of them conscripts, who did believe the myth that they were going to take part in a special operation and had no idea that they were going to war. Were told they'd be met with flowers and people praising their arrival in their country. And I mean, the point is, there are victims on both sides of wars, and young people dying, anyone dying, but young people dying in particular on either side. Really, one isn't any better than the other. What's particularly concerning, though, about this new development is that they seem to be specifically targeting not just residential areas, but things like schools and community centres, hospitals. We'll come on to the story about the theatre in Mariupol, but they knew that that was somewhere where people were sheltering. So does that constitute a war crime, or is that just a normal collateral damage of war?
I suppose it could be taken as either, but I would say that it's war crimes. I wonder whether the fact you mentioned the fact that the Russian army is high in conscripts that didn't know that they were being sent into a war zone in the Ukraine. So I wonder if it's their inexperience that means that they shell civilian buildings rather than military facilities, or whether the orders are coming from higher up. And I don't know which it would be, but I suspect it must be the orders are coming from higher up. But whether it's orders from their commander on the battlefield or whether it's coming from Moscow, I've got no idea.
Well, of course, the Russians didn't just meet 100,000 Ukrainian troops, which is what they thought they were going to meet. They met 40 million Ukrainians determined to defend their country to the death, quite literally, sadly. And that's something that people who know the history of that world could have predicted was going to happen. And so I think when they're faced with such a massive citizen resistance, then I think that's why they are attacking citizens. It's about wearing them down, beating them down, making them, the citizens who are the people who are doing a lot of the really important defending, feel that they're being destroyed. One of the interesting things that's happened, though, since the killings of the 10 people who were standing in a bread queue, is that has now been reported as exactly that 10 people were killed by the Russians in a bread queue by the Chinese media. Now, up until now, China's media seem to have been playing along with Putin's official line that it was a special operation, it's not a war. And just so viewers can understand that you're not allowed in Russia to refer to it as a war. And if you do, then you can be arrested and you can face up to 15 years imprisonment, which is why that particular brave young woman in the television studio took such a risk. But unfortunately, although she's been fined, I understand that's only for one indiscretion on Instagram, and the trial about what she did on television is still to come. But China has been playing along with that. They've been quite bland in their coverage. I'm wondering, do you think this is a sense that China are breaking ranks and that maybe Putin can't really rely on them so much? And let's face it, the Chinese are pretty canny. Are they beginning to understand that world opinion is against Russia and that maybe there's no clear sign that Russia is going to win this war.
Yeah, I think that probably is the case, because I also heard reports today that China has said that they had no prior knowledge that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and that if they had had any prior knowledge of that, they would have tried to prevent it or would have advised against Putin taking that move. So I think there is a divide beginning to appear between the two. And yet, I've also been hearing reports that China's maybe thinking about making a similar move to Taiwan. And so if they can see Putin getting away with this kind of behaviour in Ukraine, then maybe that would make them bolder towards Taiwan. So I don't know if they do have their eye on Taiwan, then I think they would actively support China, but that's not what we're hearing.
Yeah, well, they do have their eye on Taiwan. Everyone is aware of that, and I think it's a bit disingenuous of the Chinese to say they'd no forward warning of the invasion. We were reporting, everyone has been reporting since October last year, of the build-up of troops on the border, and not just that, but that the offensive was meant to be happening in February. So we might not know it, we might not have seen the top secret files, but it didn't really come as a huge surprise that he was going to try something. But that's just the Chinese being inscrutable, perhaps, and playing the cards close to their chest.
It's probably me being naive as well, though.
Survivors have been emerging from the basement of a theatre in the devastated city of Mariupol that was hit by a Russian airstrike, despite being a designated shelter for hundreds of civilians, including children and elderly people, officials have said. As 21 people were reported dead in a strike on a school and community centre near Kharkiv, and 53 bodies arrived at morgues in Chernihiv, both in the north, rescuers were clearing rubble from the basement of the drama theatre in the southern port city. Nearly a day after the attack, there were no reports of deaths, but with intense street fighting cutting off communications in much of the city, there were also conflicting reports about how many survivors had emerged from the basement shelter, which appeared to have held firm. Russia denied bombing the theatre. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova has said in Moscow that allegations that Russia had bombed the building were a lie, repeating the Kremlin's assertion that Russia's armed forces don't bomb towns and cities. As recently as Monday, large white letters on the ground in front of and behind the theatre spelled out children in Russian, Deti, to alert warplanes of those inside, according to images from the Maxar space technology company. Pavlo Kriklenko, the head of the Donetsk Regional Administration, said Russian airstrikes also hit a municipal swimming pool complex in Mariupol, where civilians had been sheltering. There are pregnant women and women with children under the rubble there, he said. The number of casualties was not immediately known. Well, I had said earlier that they've been saying they don't bomb towns and cities, and obviously that's just nonsense. Apart from anything, we know that they bomb towns and cities in Chechnya and Syria. So, yeah, this is just propaganda. But I think that story shows something else that's increasingly difficult. It's this verification of exactly what is happening and what the casualties are, because of course there's no communication in Mariupol. There's been no electricity, no internet for about 2 weeks there. It's very difficult there's no observers getting in, it's far too dangerous. So we are relying on kind of word of mouth, and I think when there is no clear communication, when there is no clear facts, it's easy for different narratives to emerge and you don't really know what's happening. And I think the propaganda war in Ukraine is something that's really getting quite sophisticated. And that could be on both sides, let's not forget. I mean, Zelensky has been playing an absolute blinder in the way that he's been speaking to allied leaders in the last few weeks. So the propaganda war, I mean, we keep talking about how social media is an evil in some respects, that it perpetrates fake news and all the rest, but actually sometimes it's also the way of getting information out. So how are we going to find out what's really, really happening? Or do we just have to wait till it's all over and literally count the body bags?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you're absolutely right that in the middle of a war zone, then there's not going to be a single coordinated response to something like the flattening of a building by the authorities, and it will just be whoever happens to be nearby and is able to help just mucks in, and so the things like tallies and official tallies, there's probably no way we could ever expect that from a coming out of a war zone. I suspect maybe the only way that we can make any kind of sense will be from social media, when people are maybe posting video footage of what's happening at a site like that, and maybe then it's not never going to be the whole picture, and there could still be propaganda there. Images would have to be verified somehow, but I think maybe social media just might be the only way, all that we can rely on at the moment.
There have been a number of social media images that have gone viral of people claiming that the war isn't really happening, that it's all actors. It never fails to amaze me when there are people, it doesn't matter what national disaster or what war happens, there are always people who believe it isn't happening. And there have been people posting pictures of people being covered in fake blood and people painting fake blood. And it turns out these were scenes from films that were being made in the country. So it really is a case of just trying very, very hard to work out exactly what is going on. So we think that no one has been killed in the Mariupol bombing of the theatre. We'd certainly hope not, because as the story said, it was a designated shelter, but we maybe can't be sure for some time.
There is a historic precedence for that kind of thing. There's a lot of history books that were printed about the First World War that show photographs that were actually stills from Hollywood movies. And some of those images, even, I used to work in a museum with a photograph collection, and we would call upon it to supply images. We had to be quite careful if somebody was asking for a First World War image that we didn't supply one of those, prints, one of those photographs. Okay. Yeah, so it's not new at all.
It's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
What we are sure about is that lawyers are busy drafting a peace deal between Kyiv and Moscow, but a breakthrough depends on the Kremlin accepting a ceasefire, Ukraine's defence minister has said, as France has accused Russia of pretending to negotiate. Alexei Reznikov, who has been leading the Ukrainian delegation in the negotiations, said technical work was progressing, but that Russia had to stop its shelling for any compromise to be possible. Speaking via video link to MEPs on the Committee of Foreign Affairs and the Security and Defence Subcommittee, Reznikov said international leaders such as Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett were trying to mediate, but that it appeared Russia would have to be forced into real negotiations. We will, of course, first of all, during the negotiations, talk about a ceasefire, about humanitarian corridors, the provision of the civilian population with evacuation, with water, with food, and maybe later we can sign this agreement for peace, he said. But on the terms of the Ukrainian people, we would never accept any capitulation, and our armed forces are ready to resist. So today we could say the negotiations are more or less on a technical level. And of course lawyers are involved, politicians are involved, but I'm not going to go into any more details about the negotiations. There are major doubts within the Ukrainian negotiating team and in Western capitals about whether Putin is engaging with the talks in good faith. The French minister Jean-Yves Le Drian said in an interview published today that he believed the Russian president was pretending to negotiate as part of a battle plan he used in both Chechnya and Syria. Russia is demanding that Ukraine become a neutral state and abandon its aspirations to join NATO, while also accepting the loss of the Crimea, which Moscow illegally annexed in 2014, and the self-recognised regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, as to NATO, Ukraine have kind of conceded that already. So Zelensky came out last week or earlier this week and said, not that we don't want to join NATO, but that we can't join NATO, that open door has a barrier in front of it. Now, he's been pretty canny here because he asked NATO to do something that he knows NATO can't do, and that is to supply air cover and a no-fly zone, because he knows what that would lead to. And so he's very carefully sort of manipulating that narrative, and so that it looks like it's NATO that's barring the Ukraine from joining. So he gets to save some face. It also gives Russia one of the things that they want. So Putin gets to save face. And I think when it comes down to negotiations, the story has the word compromise in it. I think that's what negotiations are about. I'm not sure what the Ukrainian official position is on Crimea or the other two regions in the east. I mean, I pretty much think they had given up on the Crimea. It's been 8 years since Crimea was annexed. But I'm not sure about the other two regions. They might be prepared to let them go. But I think for the Ukrainians, the key thing is that they remain an independent sovereign country, that they don't become another satellite state of Russia. Whether that's enough for Putin, we don't really know. Maybe it is just about keeping this buffer country between NATO allies and Russia. Who knows? So, you know, I don't know if you've been following the kind of peace negotiations, but what's your feeling? Do you think Putin is pretending? Do you think there is any possibility? And do you think that Ukraine will be able to maintain its individual sovereignty at the end of all of this?
I hope it will be able to maintain its sovereignty by the end of all of this. I think it's good that talks are taking place, so at least there's theoretically a possibility that there's going to be some kind of agreement. But I think ultimately everybody knows that Putin and Russia, they cannot be trusted. What their aim is in the negotiations, whether they are seriously willing to come to some kind of peace or ceasefire, I suppose time will tell. I'm racking my brain about Crimea and the other two regions that you mentioned. I don't think they were historically part of Ukraine going back centuries. I think they were added to the Ukraine post-Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but the problem with Europe is you can't base yourself. I mean, Poland disappeared as a country between the wars. You know, nobody's suggesting that Poland shouldn't exist as a country. And that's the problem. You know, we live in an island state, so our borders are fixed. They don't change, apart from coastal erosion. You know, nobody's coming along and within that island state, the borders may shift and change as, you know, constitutional change, whatever. But it doesn't change. We are fixed and immutable. That is not the case really on any other country on a major landmass, and it certainly isn't the case across Europe. You know, you had individual states in Italy that were unified, you had individual states across Prussia that were unified into Germany, and as I say, Poland disappeared literally off the face of the map for about 30 years. So this argument that it did belong to someone else and it wasn't is kind of, there's really no validity about that. If it's now within the borders of a sovereign state, it belongs to that sovereign state. I mean, that might be a bit like, you know, should Scotland become independent, you know, London sending in the tanks because they can't agree about who really owns Berwick upon Tweed, because let's face it, it's chopped and changed over the years. One of the interesting things, though, the Ukrainians are saying that they will negotiate the peace on Ukrainian terms. The harsh reality is the winner dictates the terms of a peace, not the loser, and it's by no means clear who's going to come out on top yet. But let's hope that at least the humanitarian negotiations continue. Back now in the UK ferry operator P&O Ferries have sacked 800 British crew across its entire fleet after stopping all its sailings on Thursday. Unions called on government to halt what it called a scandalous betrayal, with P&O planning to use cheap agency staff to operate its ships. The operator, owned by the Dubai-based DP World company, earlier told crew to return to port and await a major announcement in a sudden move likely to cause serious disruption to travel for passengers and freight. Security staff were preparing to remove crew from ships in Dover and Larne, Belfast after unions instructed crew not to leave the vessels. Coaches carrying replacement agency staff, brought in from Colombia, according to reports in the French press, were reported to be standing by at Dover and Hull. The RMT union said that guards with handcuffs were seeking to board ships to remove crew so they could be replaced with cheaper labour. SNP MSP Emma Harper is deeply concerned by the reports that P&O has sacked all its staff, including those who work on the critical Scotland to Northern Ireland routes. The MSP for the south of Scotland, which includes the ferry ports at Cairnryan, has offered her full support to the workers fired by video call. Commenting, Emma Harper said, "These developments are deeply concerning for the P&O employees and the communities these ferries serve. These services are essential for the local economy and are a critical route for many businesses here in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. They also support jobs in the port and in local businesses which service the ferry routes. All of these are now made more vulnerable by this shocking decision. This appears to be a deeply cynical decision by P&O's owners, who've been allowed to use such immoral tactics because the UK Tory government has blocked laws that would properly protect the rights of hard-working staff. When I saw the story break today, I must admit I was absolutely astonished, and I heard myself saying, we've gone back to the industrial relations landscape of the 1960s. However, it appears to be not as clear-cut as that. It's not yet clear, and none of the reports that I've managed to read so far can verify this, but it appears that most of the P&O ships are not British-flagged vessels. They're flagged in Cyprus and other parts of the world. And it also seems to be that maritime at-sea workers, therefore, are not necessarily covered by the sort of workers' rights legislation that other people would be in the UK, especially around redundancy. So if this was a company on land in Britain, they couldn't do this. There'd be no consultation on redundancy, there's been no notice period, and you don't make people redundant, you make jobs redundant. So you can't sack a whole bunch of people and then just replace them with cheaper people. That's not redundancy. And so they would have broken the law. But it seems that these rights don't extend. That point hasn't been made by any of the unions representatives that have spoken. But we need to get to the bottom of this. So when the UK government say, we are standing by to help, that's the first thing. They need to clarify this position of these workers, and they need to do something to mitigate if it is the case that this company can just drive a cart and horses through these workers' rights.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's something that I wasn't aware of at all before this broke today, but apparently other companies like P&O around the world, it's a similar situation already. So the crew on these ferries, they might, for example, be they might be working on routes that are in the UK or between the UK and Europe, but they're actually all Filipino with Filipino passports, and so they're not domiciled here in the UK. They don't work in the UK technically, as you say. They're working offshore. Certainly, P&O, they're not coming out of this very well at the moment. And had a look, and DP World, their parent company, saw profits last year leap 52% to $475 million. And I think they also took furlough money, and they paid out £250 million to their shareholders. So it's not hurting the parent company, it's not hurting the shareholders. Again, it's just the staff have been abandoned by the company. And all of this is, post-COVID, post-Brexit, and at a time when we're facing
it's
crises.
bad corporate governance. P&O announced that they've been making losses of 150 million year on year, and it can't go on. Well, if you're making losses of 150 million year on year, of course it can't blooming well go on. But you know that you can't just keep it going and then suddenly pull the rug. There needs to be something done so that companies cannot continue to operate in these circumstances. And yes, okay, we know that COVID has made it harder and harder, but the suggestion is that these issues with P&O have existed for a lot longer. It's a real turn. It could be a real issue for unions here. How much are the unions going to be able to do about this? If they don't manage to get some of this reversed, or they don't manage to get some decent deals for people, there's always why join a union? This is what makes it strange. The reports are talking about British workers being affected, not Filipinos. They're members of a British union. So the suggestion would be these are British people, many of whom may actually live in the ports that they operate out of. I guess that's what Emma Harper's talking about when she's talking about communities being damaged. I think the other question is, these van loads of Colombians or wherever they're from, how did they get into the country? You're not able to get into Britain anymore unless you've got a job. It's meant to be really, really difficult. So what on earth has happened?
Yeah.
Does it just suit them to let anybody in whenever? We can let the foreigners in as long as they're about to screw British jobs.
Yeah, it's incredible. They can sort it when they need to or when they want to. You're absolutely right. I made a couple of notes about what I was going to maybe have to contribute to this item, and one of the words that I've got written down in capitals is visas. It's especially when there's people in Ukraine trying to get into this country, and that's not happening at the moment.
Well, apparently you don't need visas if you're working on a ship, so that's nice and easy for everyone.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was hinting at, I suppose. It's like, I think when Emma Harper talked about communities, I imagine she might be thinking about the lorry drivers and the cafes and the restaurants where that maybe depend on people going on a ferry. But I think that the situation in these other international companies, maybe not P&O at the moment, but these staff, they live and work on the ferry. They don't have a rented room offshore or something like, and that's why they're able to get round that or get through that loophole about not being British.
There's a lot more clarity needs to come out about this story, and we really need to understand just who it is that's losing their. It doesn't matter who's losing the job. It's an appalling way to lose your job by video call, a pre-recorded 3-minute message with no chance to ask questions. Absolutely inhumane.
Staff are being, it's like a commodification of the staff.
Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. So moving on, a short life task force has been established to monitor, identify and respond to any potential disruption to food security and supply resulting from the impact of the war in Ukraine. The Scottish Government has set up the Food Security and Supply Task Force jointly with the industry. It will be co-chaired by Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Islands, Maggie and Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink, James Withers. Drawing on technical and scientific knowledge and expertise from across a range of sectors, agencies and organisations, the task force will include key food and drink industry leaders and will meet frequently over the coming weeks. Ms Goujon said, "The truly terrible events in Ukraine and the resulting Western sanctions on Russia are rightly changing the way the world does business. Our immediate focus as a government continues to be on doing everything we can within our power to support the people of Ukraine and address their humanitarian need. We need to take action now to better understand the potential impact of disruption to the food supply chain in Scotland, how industry and government might work together to manage and mitigate those, and be alert to the resulting impact on the cost of food products. Over the last 2 years, our food and drink sectors have experienced a series of shocks in terms of disrupted supply chains and new barriers to trade through COVID and Brexit. It's clear that the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine will have another further impact, not least through the hugely challenging increases in energy bills, which affect households and everyone in the food industry, from farmers to hauliers, processors to retailers. That is why the Scottish Government has convened a task force jointly with industry to monitor, identify and respond to these issues, as well as recommending actions that can be taken by businesses, the Scottish and UK Government to mitigate the challenges. I'd like to think this was a slightly wider initiative than just Scotland. I'm sure it's happening across Europe and there must be a lot of intelligence. I'm guessing really what she's talking about is a way of finding new markets and supply chains. The thing that always occurs to me in a war situation, there are the losers, but then there's also the winners. There are other people who can make a lot of profit out of war. War profiteering used to be a crime. And you think about the energy prices. Increasingly, information is coming out that war on these energy prices were way going to be high before the war on Ukraine came. That isn't really necessarily why energy prices are high. It just is a way of the government masking the fact, the British government, that they're doing nothing to mitigate this. So new markets and new supply chains are fine, but at any cost. I mean, look what we're doing with energy. So you've got Johnson saying, I won't be bullied by those nasty Russians over oil and gas. Instead, I'll get on a plane, I'll go to Saudi, the world's biggest human rights abusers, who this weekend executed 81 men, more than they've executed in the last 12 months, and I'll buddy up with them. So, Julie, what is this task force going to achieve?
Yeah, and in Saudi Arabia, they killed another 3 people when Johnson was actually in the country on top of the 81.
Did he raise it, do you think?
Well, he was very shifty on that when he was being interviewed the other day, and he said that he kind of implied that he would, but I doubt it somehow. Or if they did, they would just agree not to talk about it, and then they could say they'd raised it. But I think this food security issue is going to be really important. I think it's going to be something like climate change that we're going to be seeing more and more in the news. It's about carbon footprints. I don't know if it's about new supply chains, but Scotland could be self-sufficient in terms of its food. But at the moment, I think one of the big factors is the Ukraine being one of the biggest suppliers of wheat. The Ukrainian flag, I think, is like the yellow on the bottom is meant to be the ripening corn
Yep.
in the blue sky above, and they supply something like 30% of the world's grains. Well, they did before the invasion. But then the other thing is oil is often used in the manufacture of fertilizers and insecticides. So, and all of these prices are all going up because of the so it's just like everything else. It's like it's the really basic things at the bottom of the chain. If they get expensive, then that hike just travels. It's just passed on up through the chain. But
Interesting you mentioned Ukraine and the grain. It is known as the breadbasket. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It's also interesting to know it's exactly the issue of grain that allowed Stalin to colonise the Ukraine, with the forced famines, the deliberately created famines in the Ukraine, which killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, and then allowed Stalin to then fill those empty houses and those empty cities with ethnic Russians. So it is kind of central to the whole thing. Anyway, let's hope that Marion Goujon can make sure that our shelves are not empty. I mean, they're pretty empty at the moment because of Brexit, quite honestly. I'm often quite surprised. I mean, it was one week I couldn't get fennel. I mean, that's just...
yes.
I know it's a first world problem, but it's a first world problem that really upset me. No fennel to be had in the East End of Glasgow.
You're absolutely right. There's not as big a selection of basic things as there used to be. It's true.
The Bank of England has responded to the likelihood that the war in Ukraine will push inflation to around 10% this year by raising interest rates back to the pre-pandemic level of 0.75%. The bank's Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, voted 8-1 to increase borrowing costs by 0.25 percentage points, the first time the bank has raised rates at 3 successive meetings in more than 20 years. The bank said Russia's invasion had forced it to rethink its forecast for the peak of inflation this year, and it was now expected to be several percentage points higher than the 7.25% it had previously forecast. There had been speculation before the meeting that some MPC members might opt for a half-point increase, but only one, John Cunliffe, dissented from the majority by voting to keep interest rates on hold. The other 8 MPC members decided fresh action was needed to return inflation, currently at a 3-decade high of 5.5%, to the government's 2% target. They stressed the tightness of the labour market and upward pressures on costs and prices. The bank thinks the annual inflation rate will rise to around 8% in the second quarter of this year, and perhaps even higher later. There is a risk that rising energy prices would lead the UK energy regulator, Ofgem, to push its price cap substantially higher in October. The bank said it could do nothing to prevent those higher prices for energy and other commodities hitting living standards. To be honest, 5.5%, 8% inflation, it's already been announced that for the majority of people, personal inflation is running at around 30%. I'm not sure that this 0.25% increase is going to do very much. What it will do is it'll have a knock-on effect on mortgages just at the time when the housing market is heating up again in the UK. Property is going for silly money at the moment. That's partly triggered because obviously the market was depressed over COVID. Nobody could go out and visit houses. Nobody was moving. Now everybody wants to go live in the country and work from home. And prices are rocketing. So here again, we're just going to see the screw tightened even more. We just wonder when the end is. Is there an end in sight?
I don't think there is an end in sight. You mentioned mortgages. I think the other thing that people often think of in this kind of story is savings, but I would imagine that this is also maybe going to impact wages. I don't think it's going to affect whether what kind of wage rises people are going to be seeing in the near future. But you can tell I'm not an economist, can't you?
Well, there's going to be strikes. That's what's going to happen, because you're right. People are going to demand higher wages, and the public sector have set what their cap's going to be, and that's often a kind of, sort of guide for lots of other people. And people will be saying, well, 3%, 2.5%, 3%, it's not enough. We'll go on strike.
Yeah, and it could go higher. I mean, obviously, we'll remember what it was like in the 70s, when
just because we're that old, Brian. Yes, when inflation
maybe you
was...
can't remember.
Interest rates were 10%.
More,
which
even sometimes,
is quite remarkable.
Yeah, but even, and the house prices that you mentioned about people wanting to live in the country and work from home, but even further down the property chain, I think when people were in lockdown and cooped up in their 2-bedroom flat realised that they really needed a 3 or a 4-bedroom flat, or just with no balcony or a garden. So I think these are even the things that people are wanting to try and for the next time they have to go into lockdown. But I think the chances are that I think inflation's going to go a lot higher than this before we're done.
And just to prove then that that's going to make it harder for people just to afford to live, there's been a new report that shows 1/3 of Scots claiming universal credit cannot afford to eat or heat their homes. The SNP has demanded the UK government reverse its cuts to universal credit and scrap the widely condemned 5-week wait. A report published today by the Trussell Trust reveals that over 1/3, 36% of Scots on universal credit, said they'd skipped meals because they couldn't afford to buy enough food. And 1 in 3, 30%, said they had been unable to heat their homes for more than 4 days across the month. 1 in 6 had to rely on a food bank. The report also revealed that 36% of Scottish universal credit claimants had fallen into debt because they couldn't keep up with essential bills. Across the UK, half of people on universal credit reported they are already behind on their bills or facing a constant battle to keep up with them. The SNP has repeatedly called on the UK government to reverse the £20 cut to universal credit and scrap the 5-week wait for the first payment, which sees people taking out an advance payment loan to get by and then fall into or further into debt. I think the debt issue is really something to be concerned about. The number of loan sharks and payday loans and what looks like easy credit that's swilling around but actually comes at a huge price. APR rates of 96%, even 100%, is not that unusual when you look at the small print. But people don't look at the small print when they're desperate, do they?
No, and I've been hearing stories of people, I mean, it's savage. I've heard stories of people turning off their fridge to save on electricity, and people having indoor coats and outdoor coats, which basically means that they have to wear a coat indoors, and then when they're going outdoors they then change into a bigger, warmer coat, but having to wear coats indoors, it is incredible. But you were asking about loan sharks. Yeah, I mean, even these stores which you see on high streets where you can go in and buy a television on hire purchase, and by the time you look at the payment plans and how much it's going to actually have cost for that item by the time you finish it, it's incredible. They're not cheap. They look as if they're helping you out and this is going to be cheap and it's going to, but by the end of the day, it's never, never, isn't it?
It is on the never, never. And you know, more and more people are being offered what looks like cheap credit or being offered credit who would never have been given credit before. Well, there's maybe a reason for that. I mean, it's the whole thing about subprime mortgages. People who really weren't in a position to guarantee they could pay back their mortgages took advantage of subprime mortgages, and that's what led to the financial crash. It's the same with people being offered credit and loans that they really are not in a position to manage carefully. And I don't think there's a generally high level of good financial management sort of out there in the community. I don't think people are very good at managing their money. You know, I think it's just all too easy. And as you say on the never, never, I was always brought up to believe that you couldn't have it. If you couldn't afford it, you couldn't have it. Now, I'm not saying I don't have the odd credit card, but I think this is a perfect storm coming. Rising prices, wages not keeping up with prices, universal credit payments, the loss of that extra money, that £80 a month, has been devastating. And let's not forget, the vast majority of people on universal credit are
in work.
working.
That's what I was just about to say.
It's in work poverty. These are not people who are sitting about in their backsides just, you know, painting their nails and doing nothing. These are people who are working and they can't afford to make ends meet. And if there is a bigger push on wages, as might come, and some firms feel they have to respond to that, then the chances are more people get thrown out of work. It's just an absolute perfect storm. And it really is difficult to see where this is all going to end, except really, really badly for people who are already vulnerable.
Yeah, I think it should be taught, finance should be taught in school, you know, just like, and the very fact that I don't really understand that previous story about the interest rates. It's like that should be something that's taught at a fundamental level, along with your reading and your writing and your arithmetic. Your 3
Absolutely.
Rs
And I mean,
so.
there are some excellent agencies out in the community who can give really good money and debt advice and who can really help people understand. But they're not always easy to get referrals to. They're pretty busy. And everybody needs that. It isn't just people who are, seen to be at the bottom end of society. We could all do with a bit more financial intelligence, I think. The SNP has criticised the UK government plans to close 42 Department for Work and Pensions offices, putting 1,100 jobs on the line. The closures will see some offices merged and 12,000 DWP staff moved to alternative sites, a move the PCS union has warned will risk thousands more jobs when the changes come into effect. In an urgent question in the House of Commons earlier today, the party's Shadow Fair Work and Employment spokesperson, Chris Stevens MP, demanded to know whether economic inequalities assessments had been made on the closures, many of which are occurring in high economic deprivation areas, warning that many staff members, particularly those with disabilities, may not be in a position where they're able to work from other offices. Mr Stevens called for the planned closures and redundancies to be categorically ruled out. The MP for Glasgow South West blasted the rank hypocrisy of the closures in high-risk areas so soon after the release of the UK government's Levelling Up white paper. Of the 42 total closures, 8 are in Scotland. They're in Aberdeen, Ebury House, Kirkcaldy on Victoria Road, Bathgate on Whitburn Road, Dundee, Lindsay House, Falkirk, Callender Gate, Glasgow, Clydebank, Glasgow Springburn and Stirling on St Ninian's Road. The Aberdeen and Kirkcaldy sites will both close without alternatives for staff on offer. Now, we should stress that this is DWP offices, back office. They are claiming it's not job centres, so it's not going to affect face-to-face claimants being able to walk into their job centre and claim. However, we did see a raft of closures about 4 years ago, which did exactly that. It was all about merging. It was all about reducing the amount of estate that they were managing. And I would be worried that this is maybe the thin end of the wedge and that you could actually see more job centres closing. But either way, this is pretty bad news for civil servants who, of course, tend to think that their jobs are usually fairly safe. So, what are they going to go on strike? Would anybody notice?
It's true, yeah. That was always meant to be the trade-off. If you worked in the public sector, you maybe didn't get bonuses and pay rises, but you had a job for life, and those days are certainly gone. Quietly in the back of my mind, when I would hear about this story, and when you're reading that out, I'm kind of reminded of the vow back in 2014 and all the things that Scotland would be promised if they voted to stay in the United Kingdom. And more recently, that tends to, we don't hear about that so much these days. Now we hear about levelling up and how Westminster's going to let, but I think this shows that really is just an empty slogan. And it's incredibly bad news when we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Holyrood, I think, took over the responsibility for adult disability payments from the DWP.
Just this week.
Yeah, and so again, I just wonder if it's going to impact on how Scotland is able to manage its, well, hopefully better. Hopefully, if they've taken it over, then that means maybe they don't need the DWP.
No, it's now a separate agency, so they don't. But in the back office, staff are hugely important. The processing centres really are the engine of the job centre. And if they are not working efficiently or they're under pressure, then it causes more delay. And we already know that there's a 5-week delay to universal credit, and other benefits can be delayed, and assessments of benefits can be delayed. So it does have a potential knock-on effect to beneficiaries, even though they claim that they are not considering closing actual job centres. Interesting you mentioned the vow, because of course one of the things that came out of the vow was that we were going to have more powers in Scotland. We were going to be all singing and all dancing, and yet here again another story has broken that shows that's not the case. The Scottish Parliament has backed the Scottish Government's call to refuse legislative consent on the UK Government's Subsidy Control Bill. Business Minister Ivan McKee says the legislation, which replaces state aid rules lost as a result of the UK's exit from the European Union, undermines devolution, as there is no requirement to consult Scottish ministers. Mr McKee says this will limit the ability of the Scottish Parliament to scrutinise actions taken by UK Government and the Scottish Government to support businesses in a way that reflects the specific needs of the Scottish economy. The bill will implement permanent parameters around how public authorities, including government, are able to provide subsidy payments to individuals or firms. Speaking in the Scottish Parliament earlier today, Business Minister Ivan McKee said, "We are disappointed with the UK Government's decision to press ahead with the UK Subsidy Control Bill, which in its current form overrides the devolutional settlement and risks UK ministers intervening without proper consultation or knowledge of local circumstances." Now, I don't want to go into this too much because actually state aid rules are one of the things, if you can't sleep at night, read the EU Commission's handbook on state aid rules and you will fall asleep. But in its essence, it was a way to stop governments being able to preferentially subsidise companies in their own countries over companies from outside of the EU that were bidding for contracts. But there are lots of ways around it, and there have been ways around it. The British government got around it a few times. To be fair, the Scottish Government were able to get around it a few times because there were special circumstances. And it does seem that this is nothing more really than just another attempt to chip away at the devolved settlement.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Internal Market Bill as well. It seems like a similar kind of end product in that sense. It's And again, yeah, it just shows that Westminster is riding roughshod over the devolved parliaments.
You're not suggesting Westminster can't be trusted with the devolved powers, are you?
I kind of am.
Oh, my goodness.
And also, it's the same situation with Wales and Northern Ireland. It's like, again, it's I think you're going to see all the devolved nations uniting or to say the same thing, but I don't think it will make any difference.
You're seeing a lot of that, actually, especially between Wales and Scotland. They're singing on the same hymn sheet about a lot of things, despite the fact, you know, Wales is run by the Labour Party. There's quite a lot of connection between the two. And finally, we started the show blaming the leprechauns on the technical glitch at the start. It is, of course, St Patrick's Day. Look, we've even got a green sign. I don't know why it's quite so popular. Why is it that everybody wants to be Irish at least one day of the year?
I don't know. Yeah, you'd think that. Honestly, yeah, I've got no idea.
Well, the one thing is that we should mention, so close to St Patrick's Day, is that Ireland will be playing England at rugby at the weekend. And so, because it's St Patrick's Day, let's hope that Ireland do well.
Yeah. On the way in, there was people queuing outside Irish pubs already, you know. So it's.
I know. I mean, it's not just in this country. The world goes mad. They turn the river green in Chicago. Big parades in New York. Huge parade in Belfast today, which the police were getting a bit worried about. Obviously, a massive parade in Dublin. It's just it just seems quite strange. I mean, I suppose it's good news if you're Irish. It's not so good news if you're a snake, however. But I get a bit sick of all this macho Guinness drinking, can't stand the stuff myself. So I would just like to remind people that it may well be St Patrick's Day, but also it's St Gertrude's Day. And she, medieval saint from Central Europe, quite close to Kiev actually, is the patron saint of cats. So if you don't want to have a Guinness tonight, why don't you go and stroke your pussy instead? That's all from the show. We end again with our usual plea that we would like you to put your hand in your pocket and give us some money. We know that's tough. We've just been spending the evening talking about how much people's finances are being squeezed. But if you want independent broadcasting to continue, and if there's anything teaches us that independent broadcasting is necessary in this world, it's what's happening in Ukraine, then please consider supporting Broadcasting Scotland with a regular donation. www.broadcastingscotland.scot/donate. Everyone who works at the station is a volunteer. We've got a fantastic studio here with outstanding facilities. We've an outside broadcasting unit we desperately want to get on the road, but it takes money. So if you can spare something, we'd be very, very grateful. I'll be back on Sunday. In the meantime, have a good evening. Thank you.